I just want to thank everybody for coming out to listen to this extremely interesting discussion that was initiated really as a result of a conference that was held by former Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, Global Humanitarian Forum, which was looking at the impacts of climate change for the poor and the impoverished in the world. At that forum, there was a last session that had both Yvo de Boer and Jeffrey Sachs participating, and I have to say, as somebody who was in the audience, I was expecting a nice little discussion amongst the like-minded, and all of a sudden broke out a very, very interesting discussion. The ends, there's no question, and I don't want to speak for them, one hardly could in both cases. The end is very much, I think, what they both have in mind is very similar, that we have a serious, very serious threat in front of us as far as climate change is concerned. But the means, particularly as far as economic instruments and policies are concerned, there's an interesting divergence and an interesting range of views. Unfortunately, they were only able to get into the discussion for about 5 minutes. And so later that evening, we were all ensconced on a boat tour on Lake Geneva, and I was able to corner the both of them, and they were quite agreeable to the idea of having a further discussion about this very, very important issue. And I would say that right now is extremely timely. It certainly is the time for debates, both in the United States and not as many of you may be aware that we're having a Canadian election as well. So there's been a series of debates up north in Canada as well. So this being the fall of debates, I thought it would be a good idea if we also had one on this critical issue. The Kyoto Protocol, I think, many people have many different understandings and visions of what it represents. Sometimes when people are always making judgments in terms of whether Kyoto is a success or not, I'm reminded of a question once put by a European journalist to Chairman Mao about whether or not the French Revolution was a success, and he replied, "It's too early to tell." I would definitely say that was the same case with the Kyoto Protocol, but not because of whether or not individual countries met targets. The real contribution of Kyoto in 50 years' time will have been, it was the first international agreement that set a price signal on carbon. It was a very tentative price signal, but did it initiate a whole regime where we see an ever-strengthening price signal on carbon as a result of that? And in that respect, it really did set the broad parameters for a carbon market, and even went into further detail by defining the Kyoto mechanisms, the Clean Development Mechanism, joint implementation, and international emissions trading. At that time, ironically enough, the real pushers for it were the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, Australia, and the ones who were most reluctant to deal with it, frankly, were the European Union. And now we are in a completely, almost Alice in Wonderland situation, where it is the EU that is the defenders of the mechanisms and the greatest practitioners and implementers of it. And we see growing concerns, particularly coming out of North America, about the use of such mechanisms. There have been some issues. There's no question about that. And certainly in terms of implementation of such innovative instruments, one could hardly expect otherwise. There's been questions about environmental effectiveness, economic efficiency, technology transfer, wealth transfer, impacts on development, how much is required at home versus abroad. I could go on, and they will be covered in this discussion. But the real question is this a matter of just getting the wrinkles out in terms of the implementation, or do we really need a radical, and by radical I mean in its classic sense, to the root rethink of these kinds of approaches? Because this is more than an intellectual discussion. We need to address this, and very urgently. The one thing I think that there is little dispute about, and what science is showing us, is that we've got 15 to 20 years. And we have to get this right, and we have to get this as right as possible. Then first give the floor to Yvo de Boer. Yvo was appointed by UN Secretary General Kofi Annan as the new Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC on August 10, 2006. The appointment was endorsed by the Bureau of Convention. Before the UNFCCC, Yvo was Director for International Affairs in the Ministry of Housing, Spatial Planning and Environment of the Netherlands, where he was responsible for international policy and certainly played, and I can say this firsthand, a very key and critical role in influencing the climate change negotiations both in the EU and more broadly internationally. So Yvo, please. come up and make your initial presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, John, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to continue the discussion with Jeff and with others. I think we all know that the Stern Review on the economics of climate change tells us that by accepting some short-term pain, we stand to reap a lot of long-term gain. And although still a hard political sell, this was, I think, a convincing argument till just a few weeks ago. But since then, things have changed, and things have changed dramatically. And I believe that you cannot pick an empty pocket, and a demandeur cannot afford to be picky. Climate change, as you know, is a huge global problem in need of a global solution to reduce the costs of both mitigation and adaptation. And while concerted action significantly reduces the costs, it's clear that we will need all the tools at our disposal to rise to this global challenge. As a result, I think, and I hope you'll agree, that it is rather futile to debate the carbon market versus carbon tax, because in reality we need the carbon market and national taxes and much more, including a clever financial architecture for effective climate change abatement. That said, there is a range of benefits that recommend a market-based approach, and I would like to highlight a few. To start, we need a comprehensive international agreement that guarantees action on all fronts. This requires global buy-in, especially from the private sector, since the largest amount of funds, up to as much as 86% according to our calculations, of the clean technologies are actually in the hands of the private sector. Large sectors of that private sector prefer market-based approaches over taxation because this increases the economic opportunities of climate change abatement, both in terms of investment opportunities and in terms of job creation. A market-based approach is acceptable to civil society because environmental benefits can be checked and assured. Then there is the matter of information asymmetry. A tax and an emissions trading scheme are only identical in outcome when governments have full knowledge of the costs of abatement. The first phase of the European emissions trading scheme showed that this is not realistic. Governments do not have precise knowledge of the cost of abatement and need a market mechanism to deliver price discovery. Another important factor to keep in mind is dynamic efficiency, which occurs at two levels. On the first level, the market sets a dynamic incentive for emission reductions as prices change to reflect supply and demand. Whereas taxation rates are hard to change, and therefore the incentive for further reductions tends to become static. On the second level, the market promotes awareness and involvement. Cap and trade creates a new asset class which attracts interest from finance departments and market makers. Many of the emission reduction projects in livestock raising, for example, would never have happened with taxation of methane, as companies would have preferred to absorb the cost increase. A market mechanism stimulates a more proactive response. A market approach allows for graded levels of involvement, and this is vital in a United Nations context. So, how has the market-based approach in its current form under the Kyoto Protocol done so far? The question to ask is, has the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism met the goal for which it was designed? And in my view, the answer to this question is yes. There are now more than 1,170 registered CDM projects in 49 countries. Everything from community electrification to landfill gas capture to industrial chemical projects destroying extremely potent greenhouse gases. Of these projects, more than a third transfer climate-friendly technologies to developing countries. We've just concluded the first year of a 5-year commitment period, and already more than 195 million certified emission reduction credits have been issued, or certificates I should say, have been issued to some 400 projects. And that is equivalent to 195 million tons of CO2 emissions avoided. And let's look at some of the CDM's further accomplishments. The CDM is stimulating developing country and private sector involvement in emission reductions while it helps to identify cost-effective opportunities for emission reductions. The CDM has provided an important source of investment and financial flows for mitigation action in developing countries. It's estimated that the Clean Development Mechanisms project that entered the pipeline in 2006 will result in a $25 billion capital investment. And it's also estimated that CDM renewable energy and energy efficiency projects that were registered during 2006 will result in a $5.7 billion capital investment. And this is about triple the amount of official assistance for energy policy and renewable energy projects in those same countries. And through a 2% levy on CDM projects, the Clean Development Mechanism is also filling a fund for adaptation in developing countries. Now, all of this said, I'm not blind to the challenges that the CDM has faced, although many of these, I believe, are normal teething problems that new initiatives, especially large ones, face. One of the key challenges is additionality, ensuring that emission reductions are additional to what would have taken place without the project. The rules, tools, and guidance now in place under the CDM mean that we have an acceptable level of certainty that reductions are in fact additional. In the end, however, a balance must be struck between, on the one hand, removing every speck of doubt about additionality and as a result turning down a great many perfectly good projects, and on the other hand, taking a too lax approach to additionality. I think that the CDM has managed to strike the balance. Many argue that the CDM is actually too strict. Some would like to see a paring down of the layers of oversight. Bottlenecks in the regulatory process must be addressed and are being addressed to ensure a smooth and steady flow of registered projects and credit issuances. Then there is the question of CDM and sustainable development. Apart from reducing greenhouse gas emissions, CDM projects are meant to assist countries in achieving sustainable development goals. How this criterion is applied is left up to the host countries themselves. Granted, it is sometimes not obvious how capturing emissions from a waste dump can contribute to development. But let me use such a project in Bali as an example. There, the ability to earn CDM credits has led to the construction of a waste sorting facility, installation of a generator fueled by gas captured from organic waste. It has stopped the dump encroaching into a surrounding mangrove swamp, and not least, it has provided steady, healthy employment. Some projects are even harder to reconcile with the CDM's sustainable development criteria. But even the lucrative industrial gas projects have their role to play. In China, for example, a full 65% of credits produced from HFC 23 projects go into a sustainable development fund. Now, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the CDM is relatively new. Whatever criticisms there are of the mechanisms should not be tempered by reflection on just how far the mechanisms have come. In fact, they have created a global environmental currency and in the process have shown in a practical way how a project-based mechanism can work. And this is just the beginning. The CDM has, I believe, tremendous potential. To achieve that potential, it must be scaled up substantially in terms of both applicability and geography. There are fears that the CDM could unfairly subsidize competitive advantages of developing countries. However, the CDM is an important way to engage developing countries in climate change action. At the same time, the uneven geographical distribution of projects must clearly be addressed. In Africa, for example, there are just 27 registered projects. And while those 27 projects alone are expected to generate a $3.9 billion capital investment, it is clear that Africa needs to benefit more from the Clean Development Mechanism. And this is currently being addressed through specially targeted initiatives which are beginning to bear fruit. Also, as part of the negotiating process, countries are in the process of identifying ways to improve the CDM. They agreed, for example, to consider improvements in scope, effectiveness, efficiency, accessibility, contribution to sustainable development, and the transfer of technology. To rise up to the challenge of climate change, we will need to build on and improve the tools that we have at our disposal. Two of the most powerful tools are the carbon market and market-based mechanisms like the Clean Development Mechanism. The agreed outcome in Copenhagen needs to ring in the global transformation to a low-emissions economy. The two-year negotiating process under the Climate Change Convention presents the world with a window of opportunity to craft an economically viable solution to climate change. Current indications show that parties are committed to a strengthened outcome in Copenhagen in 2009 that results in real emission reductions and has support mechanisms to reduce the cost of mitigation and to leverage funding for adaptation. Parties have already indicated that market-based instruments under the Kyoto Protocol should continue beyond 2012. And this is a clear indication of their effectiveness. Furthermore, at the UN Climate Change Conference in Bali last year, all parties to the convention agreed to step up mitigation actions, including by considering the opportunities of using markets. Another clear indication of the effectiveness of this approach. At the same time, the carbon market will not adequately respond to all the challenges we face. Markets do what markets do. They cherry-pick the cheapest options and don't guarantee an even geographical distribution. We need a global economic transformation if we want to keep climate change manageable and economic losses due to impacts at a minimum. To illustrate this point, according to the International Energy Agency, global energy demand will grow by 55% by 2030. In the period up to 2030, the energy supply infrastructure worldwide will require a total investment of $22 trillion, with about half of that investment being made in developing countries. If we do not manage to green these investments, to direct them in a climate-friendly direction through climate-friendly technologies, emissions will increase by 50% instead of going down by 50% as science tells us they should. If emissions go up by 50%, there is a good chance that we will be put on a road to unmanageable climate change. Economic development and poverty eradication in developing countries cannot happen without energy. The question is, where will the $11 trillion worth of energy investment needed in developing countries come from? A carbon market and market-based mechanisms, like the Clean Development Mechanism, are essential for achieving the large shifts in investments required, such as for energy supply, on the scale that is required to put the world on a clean path to development. However, given the limits of the carbon market, it is clear that we need two sets of tools. The first relates primarily to the private sector, and here we are talking about a cap and trade and market-based mechanisms. The second relates to what governments can do, especially through government-to-government cooperation. And here we're essentially talking about taxes, standards, and subsidies. In short, we need different horses for different courses. What we are looking for is a set of tools that create value for green growth, an intelligent mix of mechanisms that will spur both public and private money flows through different channels at both the national and the international level. We are hopefully setting out on an incredibly ambitious journey, but under very difficult circumstances. Playing down the challenges we face and rejecting tools needed to complete it will not ring credibly in the ears of those that have to take responsibility for some tough political choices that lie ahead. Thank you.
Dr. Sachs is Director of the Earth Institute and Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and from 2000 to 2006 he was Director of the UN Millennium Project and Special Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan on the Millennium Development Goals. He is also President and co-founder of Millennium Promise Alliance, a nonprofit organization aimed at extending extreme global poverty. Dr. Sachs?
Thanks very much, John. And thanks, Yvo, very much for being here. Yvo is doing a fabulous job of trying to hold the world together and steer us toward an effective agreement. And nothing that I say should take away for one moment from his great leadership in this, and also to underestimate the profound challenge that he faces, and indeed the whole world faces, in finding a way to reach an agreement. I'm not convinced that the current architecture is getting us all that far. That's the basic problem. I think we are making small steps in the right direction, but I don't really see us in the current path as really turning the trajectory as sharply and dramatically as we need to do it. I also am not so keen on sending our best and brightest off to do more financial market engineering, although there will be a lot of unemployed financial engineers, I suppose, that can do this. But I think the kind of meltdown that we have right now is a little bit of an example of how we've taken a generation of brilliant young people and put them to tasks that really, in the end, don't really solve social problems, because having a lot of people engineer financial instruments for carbon when there are much more direct ways to do this strikes me as not really a great investment. So I'm not so keen on the Wall Street approach to carbon, just as I'm not so keen on the Wall Street approach to CDOs and MBSs and ABSs and CDO squares and credit default swaps and all the rest. I think we can simplify this agenda and get more closely to where we need to go. So we're talking basically about architecture because we all agree, and certainly Yvo and I agree, that the situation is urgent, that carbon emissions need to be constrained sharply, that we're aiming for something like a halving of global carbon emissions by mid-century in a context where the world economy could triple or quadruple given the growth of China and India and Brazil and Africa, other developing regions right now. So the question is how this can be brought about, and I think things like the Clean Development Mechanism are just, unfortunately, very small, marginal tools that aren't going to really change the broad framework of how energy is produced and how technology is developed and distributed. So what are the big architecture questions for the international system? I think the first is the so-called Annex 1, non-Annex 1 distinction. Under Kyoto, the countries that have bound obligations are essentially the high-income countries and the post-communist countries of Central Europe and the former Soviet Union. And the rest of the world can voluntarily take on commitments. I think this is the first piece of architecture that needs to change. It's just unrealistic in my view. I think all countries need to take on commitments, though the commitments for the poor countries need explicitly to make sure and make clear that the commitments are in a context of not only economic growth and development, but actually what I call convergent economic growth and development. That is high growth and development, fast enough to significantly and systematically narrow the per capita income gaps with the richer countries. But I think it's a non-starter, for example, to think that China won't have bound commitments in the next round, because I don't see how the United States would ever sign an agreement without China having bound commitments. Just for lots of reasons, but by the way, in my view, lots of good reasons. It's the world's major emitter. The emissions are growing dramatically. This problem can't be solved without China, and I don't see CDM as being a way to get China to be making the phenomenal changes that will be needed strategically. And so we're going to need a different kind of architecture, it seems to me. And I believe the basic point is we should end the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 distinction. Of course, common but differentiated responsibilities is a basic principle that I fully subscribe to. But to differentiate by saying that only one part of the world is bound and the other part not, I think is passé at this point. Second is global financing. Whatever is done, poor countries are going to need a lot of resources to do the things they need to do. I don't believe for one moment that a 2% levy on the CDM would ever do more than the tiniest fraction of the large-scale financing that will be needed. That's financing for all sorts of things, for technology transfer, for implementation, for demonstration projects, for adaptation. I think, in essence, we're going to need a significant pool of international resources, which I think could come from essentially carbon taxation. I'm going to say in a moment whether you auction permits or whether you tax is a kind of fine point in the weeds for me that I think one is better than the other, but in any event, we're going to have to devote, in my opinion, a significant amount of financing, tens of billions of dollars that won't come on the backs of small levies on individual projects, but are going to have to be a dedicated financing system. The third point is mechanisms. Economists love to jump to mechanisms before they jump to reality. The realities are about what kind of technologies can be deployed, how we're going to produce power in the future, what kind of power plants, what kind of automobiles people will drive, what kind of buildings will be constructed. Economists like to think, but I think it's a fairy tale, that the price signal is the main determinant of those things. Prices matter, they're signals, but prices alone don't determine technology pathways. They don't determine the major rollout of whether you have nuclear power or don't have nuclear power. They don't determine how a national distribution grid, long distance transmission of renewables, say from the wind of the northern plain states of the US or from the Mojave solar utilities will reach the rest of the country. Price signals don't do those things. Prices exist in a context of regulation, technology development, subsidy, federal land use, liability law, and so forth. And prices by themselves will not transform the scene. But economists love this, and the financial markets love it even more because they get to make deals and contracts and so on. I just don't see the European trading system as changing the game in technology, for example. If you really want to change the game in technology, you need a technology policy. You need to identify potential options. You need to think about the regulatory liability, public investment, land use, public acceptability, research and development framework. That's a lot bigger than whether there's a $30 price on carbon, which can play a role, but by itself is never sufficient. And it's generally left right now to being by itself, although Yvo was very clear to say that there are many instruments needed in this. I just think we jump to the price far too early. Now, there's another big architecture question of whether we're going to have a global system that links a bunch of markets in trading, or whether we're going to have somehow national targets. And while one could make some linkages across markets, certainly, I actually don't foresee China being part of a global trading system right now. I don't even think it makes sense, really, for the nature of the Chinese economy, to think that a price signal is really going to solve the energy choice question in China, given that these are state enterprises with a particular kind of budget constraint generally a soft one, and one that needs a very different kind of decision making to bring about. So I'm of the view that we're going to have national targets, or the EU will have regional targets. There could be some linkages, but I think it is not realistic to think we'd ever have an international trading system. I also don't think it's a very good idea, by the way, and here's basically why. There's very little difference between a tax and a tradable permit from an economic point of view. There are some differences. Yvo mentioned price discovery. I don't really see that as, I'd rather not discover the price, I'd rather set the price, actually. I'd rather have a tax that said for the next 20 years we're going to have at least a minimum of X dollars per ton, and that's likely to rise. I don't know what we're discovering, because all we're discovering is a demand curve right now. We're not actually discovering what needs to be done by having a certain number of permits. We don't really know, and we don't know at what prices certain technology thresholds are going to be passed or not passed. And so it doesn't really strike me as much discovery that we're getting this way. What we need to do is figure out what kind of path is most likely to bring about large-scale changes in how we produce electricity, for example. And as I said, price is a piece of it, but so is regulation, R&D, land use, real decisions. For example, in this country, are we going back to nuclear power? What are we going to do about storage of nuclear waste? What kind of transmission system are we going to have if we go for large-scale wind in the Midwest or large-scale solar? Those are big national decisions that are not going to be determined. Same kind of decision, how much are we going to drill offshore, which is, of course, one of the biggest sideshows of energy reality in the world, but is good fodder for political campaign. But those are at least policy decisions, and I think the policy decisions here are really paramount, not the exact mechanism of the price. Now, I find the tradable permit system very obtuse, actually. The reason we have it is twofold. One is that it worked well for sulfur oxide in the United States, and that was a good case because there were a few main emitters of sulfur oxide, and you needed a mechanism to get that under control. And there were no sulfur oxide mines to tax. Sulfur oxide doesn't come packaged upstream, so a tradable permit was actually an effective vehicle. The second reason we have it is that the United States is a neurotic country when it comes to taxes. And so President Clinton couldn't mention taxes. So we had to have something that didn't mention taxes. And President Clinton said, this is the most important issue for our children and our children's children, but I'll never support 1 cent on gasoline. That's kind of the funny situation that got us into Kyoto this way, and then we didn't even sign the Kyoto Protocol in the end, as was already noted. Now, what's wrong with the carbon permit system? What's the breakdown of the analogy with sulfur oxides? First, there is upstream carbon. There are just a few places we get carbon from: coal, gas, and oil. And by taxing upstream, you could choose the refinery level, you could choose the wellhead level. You tax a few places and you automatically reach a carbon price for the whole economy. If you go downstream, you literally have tens of thousands of enterprises that you're pretending to monitor at very, very high cost, making lots of deals when all you could have done administratively was put the tax upstream and be done with it. And you'd reach all sectors of the economy. So, in my view, it's just a bad analogy. If there were an upstream sulfur oxide mine, I'd rather tax that. So I think we just got stuck for funny reasons. Now, I also think we need the revenues. This country's going to have bulging deficits anyway, and everybody's realizing you have to auction the permits. Well, auctioning the permits is like having a tax. It's fiscally similar. The only difference is that with the auction, you don't really know. Supposedly you're setting a quantity, but all you're doing is setting a quantity for a year or a 3-year period. And you're not setting any price on which to make investment decisions over the next 25 years. Whereas with the tax, you set a price path that can affect regulatory decisions out for the foreseeable future. So I don't get it, actually, in terms of mechanisms, but I think this is down in the weeds because I don't really think it's the most important decision. Auctioning permits or taxing strikes me as pretty similar. But one way is scratching your ear this way, and the other way is scratching your ear that way. And if you really want to get to simple pricing of carbon, put a tax upstream on carbon. You've reached the whole economy simply, administratively, high certainty. You raise revenues, and you don't need that Wall Street set of financial engineers can become real engineers and help figure out how to actually get carbon dioxide under control. So let me skip, because I know I've run out of time, to just the basic recommendations that I would have. First, I think any agreement has to start with the primacy of development as part of sustainable development, because poor countries need to know that the idea is not that there's no longer room at the inn, that the rich countries have filled up the atmosphere and now the poor countries can't grow anymore. That's their biggest fear. And that, I think, is a legitimate fear. And rich countries are not exactly far-sighted, our country not very generous, not paying much attention to the developing world. So the developing world's worried that this is just the way to end their development. And any kind of agreement needs to do something else. So within that context, I believe that we need to set national targets that include everybody, but that build in from the start the idea that developing countries are going to grow a lot more quickly and use a lot more energy than rich countries. And so we set differential paths from the start that build in the idea of convergence in economic development. Third, that we put technological change at the core of this. This is not mainly about turning off the lights. Not that I'm against turning off the lights when you leave the room. This is mainly about what kind of power plants we have, what kind of automobiles we drive, how steel, coal, petrochemicals, cement are produced. Not to take coal out, sorry, I meant the manufacturing sector, how coal, cement, petrochemicals, refineries operate, and how buildings are ventilated. That's what this is mainly about when it comes to carbon. Plus, avoided deforestation, I should quickly add. And that pretty much gets you 95% of the issue that we're talking about. Those are big technological pathway issues, and we should focus on what kind of power systems countries can have, how they can be implemented, and national targets should enforce should aim for, I should say, we can talk about enforcement later, should aim for a steady reduction of emissions per kilowatt hour for new power plants, but understand that the trading system is, maybe it could do something on the margin, but it's not really going to be the main show for how national power strategies are actually set in the end. You could have tradable permits for power plants, but adding in tens of thousands of smaller enterprises as the European trading system does, or bringing in 1 million plus Chinese enterprises is really a make-work program for absolutely no reason, because at very, very low administrative cost, you could put the same price through the whole economy, not just through 50% of the economy. And we should understand that this is the thing to do. Finally, we're going to need a lot of revenues. Not a 2% levy on CDM, but something closer to several dollars per ton of carbon emissions for global public goods, for adaptation, for technology transfer, for research and development. There are a lot of details there. I'm gratified that the Swiss government recently proposed a $2 per ton international levy on carbon dioxide. The European Union is talking about devoting a part of its auctioning of carbon permits for these global public goods. The Norwegian government has come forward with a proposal also to use its auction revenues for this. We need big financing. Putting a price on carbon and taxing it, either through an overt tax or selling these permits, either way, that's going to be the core of the international financing system, not the individual projects. So I think there's a more direct way, and I think there's a way to get the developing countries deeply involved, and I think we need a technologically based approach to a larger extent. We both agree that putting a price on carbon is an important component. I think it carries a weight of a third of the whole strategy, not 90%. And if we're going to do it, let's tax that and subsidize geologic sequestration of carbon and avoided deforestation. And we'll have a very straightforward, predictable price for the next 25 years. And then we can get on to the real story, which is making the technological transformation.
There's a saying in my language, which is Dutch, that if you don't respect the small, you're not worthy of the big. And yes, the Kyoto Protocol is insignificant in terms of what it has delivered in terms of emission reductions, but it is the first global agreement that has laid an important foundation. And I don't think that we need to, as you say in this country, necessarily need to dump on the past in order to move effectively into the future. I spent my formative years in the United Kingdom, and to go to a different language, and there we used to call a hammer an American screwdriver. I think that in the approach going forward, given the complexity of the issue, we're going to need the hammer, and we're going to need the screwdriver, and the spanner, and the wrench, and in fact, everything that's in the toolbox to address this issue. Jeff said a lot of important things about the characteristics of a future regime on which, in fact, I would agree with him. But I don't think we were really debating the future regime so much. In that context, I would agree with him that we need to move out of this black and white world of countries with targets and countries without targets and move into a much more technicolor world that represents the differentiation that's a reality out there. But that is going to involve negotiation and intelligence. And in that context, I actually do see countries like China participating in an international emissions trading scheme. I mean, let me give you an example. Say China or any other developing country had the intention to achieve 20, 30, 40, 50% renewable energy by 2020 or 2030 or 2040. And they could attract international capital towards that renewable energy goal by issuing a renewable energy investment bond. Why wouldn't a country like China be interested in that? So in that sense, I do actually see developing countries participating in trading schemes. In fact, countries, some of them are not really developing countries anymore, like Korea and Mexico, are already talking about participating in trading schemes and are already writing that into legislation. On the question of upstream versus downstream efficiency, yes, of course, it's much more efficient to tax upstream. But I don't know how the oil-producing countries that suffer from our national disease, Dutch disease, having an oil-based economy, are going to respond to being the basis for taxation. And in fact, the people I hear squealing most in Europe at the moment about the climate energy package are in fact the upstream energy producers. So I think that would be a hard political sell. Work towards it, yes, but a hard sell. At the same time, I think it's nonsense to say that you cannot regulate thousands of downstream operators. In fact, we are at the moment monitoring and regulating millions of individual companies around the world, not perhaps in terms of their CO2 emissions, but in terms of SO2 emissions, NOx emissions, emissions of particulate, etc. So the infrastructure, I believe, is there, but the efficiency point is valid but tough to get to. Finally, the Swiss proposal for a global tax I don't think it's ever going to happen. National taxes perhaps, but I don't see a global tax emerging. But if the global, and it's a pity Dr. Lackner is gone, because if we ever were to get to a global tax that would deliver the kind of technologies that he is talking about, you would actually, through that tax, need to see a tenfold increase in energy prices to get to those kinds of technologies. And to stay in Henry's terms, I don't think any politician that proposes a tenfold increase in energy prices is going to get him or herself elected.
Okay, thank you. Jeff?
I think maybe I should clarify a few points. The global tax would not be the tax that on the margin would be providing the incentives. It's not a $50 per ton tax. It's the tax that would be providing the funding for global public goods, including technology transfer, demonstration projects, adaptation fund. So the idea of the Swiss $2 per ton is actually to raise revenues from within what countries are doing, not to be on the margin the $2 incentive, but rather we need global financing, which we don't have right now. The tiny amounts of funding for the adaptation fund or for technology transfers, these are pathetic. Raising funds for anything global right now is pathetic. Strikes me as therefore, and everything is politically hard, by the way. So I'm not sure what's politically easier or politically harder. The idea of developing countries coming into the trading system because they can sell tens of billions of dollars of bonds, well, that's obvious why they'd be interested. It's also the reason why the U.S. is not going to be interested in such a system. We're not going to be financing China implicitly or explicitly tens of billions of dollars. If we're going to be financing China, it's going to be explicit. It's not going to be by saying China has vast rights to emit and we have vast constriction on emission. Now we'll pay huge, huge amounts for China's rights. Talk about politically unreasonable. That's the mythology that underpins some developing country ideas of how this is all going to work out, that there are big bonanzas of financial transfers that are going to come implicitly. Wait for that congressional vote. Somebody's going to realize that. I'll tell you just an interesting article that was written, but you could mention 1,000 times this conversation. Mitt Romney, during the primary, came out for a carbon tax. Why did he do it? Because he said, if we go with the tradable permit system, we're going to be transferring huge amounts abroad. A tax is going to stay at home. Great argument. Actually correct. And so, not that money doesn't have to go abroad, but what Congress sends abroad is going to be known what it's sent abroad. It's not going to be a hidden tens of billions of dollars of transfer from rich to poor countries. Maybe in Europe, but not in the United States. This is a country that is not so generous and is not so forthcoming on those principles as many European countries are. And so that's actually going to stop it right from the start. And I think, therefore, what I mean about China participating in a trading scheme being very unlikely was something else. Not their desire to get tens of billions of dollars of flows. I meant the reality of monitoring hundreds of thousands of Chinese enterprises. That strikes me as wildly off base and not possible, actually, especially given that these are state enterprises to an important extent, which don't have the same kind of budget constraints. Our private sector doesn't even have those budget constraints either, we understand, as of the last month. But the idea that this is going to be driven through permits, I think, is wrong. It's interesting. Look, the idea whether you're selling a permit or whether you're putting on a tax is to raise the carbon price, and the ultimate incidence of this is relatively the same. That's what basic economics tells you. It doesn't really matter how you do it. But if you do it upstream, it's a few places to do it. It's simple. It's direct. If you do it downstream, you think you're actually hiding something. But in the end, nothing's going to be hidden, especially when those permits start being auctioned. The reason that the idea now is get the foot in the door, we give everybody grandfathered permits. Wait till they start to be auctioned to see how the vision of this process with the uncertain financial liability year after year is going to come into this system. Then it's going to be realized that these are basically the same things, but one is predictable in terms of price and the other is not predictable. One is administratively easy to deliver, one is extraordinarily difficult to deliver. I bet in the end, reality will prevail. Now, you said also, as Henry said, that he didn't notice a lot of American politicians talking about tax increases. He's absolutely correct. Our country is neurotic, as I said, when it comes to taxes. However, we also have a gaping fiscal deficit. It's about to explode, by the way, to maybe $800 billion next year. We're going to see red ink, the likes of which has never been recorded in absolute magnitudes, when the combination of our financial meltdown and this miserable undertaxation in this country and a recession all get acknowledged next year. You'll never have seen the budget deficits coming. So we're actually going to grow up a little bit and start talking about taxes again in this country, because we're trying to run a country without taxation, and we just went broke doing it. We tried to run it without personal saving, and we tried to run it without government taxation. Now we've hit the wall. We haven't yet discussed these things, but we will discuss them in this country, and then a price on carbon is not going to look so bad, because taxing the bad rather than taxing the good is going to become a good political argument as well. So my own personal view is, I learned a long time ago, don't take what's politically possible at face value. Think about what the right thing to do is. And if something's vastly easier, vastly more straightforward, recommend that, because the politics around that will turn out to be better in the end than going the indirect way, which you think is going to trick a lot of people, but in the end is going to be stopped, because we're not going to buy from China these permits, we're not going to transfer large money abroad, we're not really going to auction them this way to happy campers upstream. It's all going to come down to the same thing. It's a price, someone's going to have to pay for it, so collect it where it's predictable, easy, and upstream. Okay. I think China should take on bound national level agreements. I actually don't even see how we're going to progress politically in this country. Nervous enough about China, all of a sudden going to be binding our industry with China not. I don't believe it for one moment. China's the big question, of course, in all of this, but it's not the only one that's going to come up politically in this country, and I think it's already in Europe as well, a growing issue once this regime starts to really bite.
Yes, we need developing country engagement, but please bear in mind, and you know all of this, that the bulk of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are there at the moment are there because of industrialized countries, not because of developing countries. Yes, China and India are economic powerhouses of the world, but their per capita emissions are a fraction of what they are in industrialized countries. In India alone, there are 400 million people that don't even have access to electricity. So yes, we need to engage developing countries, but we need to respect the differences. And we need to recognize that the convention, the climate change convention that everyone, including the United States, signed, obliges developing countries to undertake policies and projects to limit the growth of their emissions, providing developed countries help out with finance and technology. So yes, they need to engage, but they need to be helped to engage. Can you achieve that help in engagement in an acceptable way politically and socially? I think so, yes, providing you also differentiate there. I think that China is way beyond the state of needing anybody else's money to advance. I think, in fact, that China is financing the American national debt, not the other way around.
Exactly.
So I don't think that China needs the money. There are possibilities to work together with countries like China. Jeff, you were talking a lot about carbon capture and storage, as was Mr. Lackner. That is an essential part of the future of coal-based economies. If you could export American coal technology to China and top up the extra costs through government-to-government cooperation, you would be exporting an American technology that does nothing to change the competitive advantage or disadvantage of China. So that would, I think, there are creative ways that we can find in terms of moving forward there. I think that the financial crisis is going to have a huge impact on the negotiations as they move forward, that it's going to influence the availability of capital, the willingness to spend, and the ability to spend towards a climate change regime. And in that sense, sometimes I say that Copenhagen is too close. In that sense, I'm quite happy that it's far away, in the hope that something will at least have improved a little bit by the time we get to Copenhagen, because money is an essential part of the solution.
In terms of the financial crisis, just a word, I think it's going to make it much harder to get an agreement on the general principle that businesses in Europe and the United States are going to say, on top of this, you're putting on higher burdens, we're trying to stay alive. And this is most unfortunate, but it comes from the idea that what we're talking about up here is all pain or technical transfers of assets or these kinds of mechanisms, as opposed to scoping out how we're going to actually help save the planet by taking a very different technological course. The fact of the matter is, one of the reasons why we're in the mess that we're in, not just one of many of the reasons, is that we've hit scarcities of conventional oil. We need alternative energy sources. That's a good signal to do something very, very different. The food crisis that also impacted this year is a climate change crisis to some extent, at least, not only, but to some extent. We've had lots of signals why it's important actually to change direction profoundly. And I think it will help if we move away from mechanisms for part of this discussion and talk about what really can be done and why it's not going to break economies. Here's what it really means, not the tricks of how to do it, by who trades what with whom, but actually what it's going to mean for men and women in their jobs, the kind of electricity we're going to get when we switch on the switch, and the kind of cars that we're going to drive in the future. Those are the main drivers of what we're talking about. And we should talk about those things. Our elected representatives will understand that a lot better, and the public will as well. And then finally at the end, we can explain that if you're going to shift to this other kind of power plant, when the regulators look at the conventional power plant and this new kind of power plant, they're going to ask, what's the lower cost? And if indeed there's a carbon price weighing on the scale in that calculation, they'll see that the lower cost is the low emission power plant. But if there's no carbon price weighing on the scales, then they're going to go with the conventional plant, as they have to under the law. Whether that's through a permit or a tax is about the 10th order of importance in this. I believe all of those smart financial engineers, I think you'll be great physical engineers too. And that's where we're going to really need the mileage to get this thing done. We also have a gaping fiscal deficit. It's about to explode, by the way, to maybe $800 billion next year. We're going to see red ink, the likes of which has never been recorded in absolute magnitudes, when the combination of our financial meltdown and this miserable undertaxation in this country and a recession all get acknowledged next year. You'll never have seen the budget deficits coming. So we're actually going to grow up a little bit and start talking about taxes again in this country, because we're trying to run a country without taxation, and we just went broke doing it. We tried to run it without personal saving, and we tried to run it without government taxation. Now we've hit the wall. We haven't yet discussed these things, but we will discuss them in this country, and then a price on carbon's not going to look so bad, because taxing the bad rather than taxing the good is going to become a good political argument as well.
I think that my closing remark would be that I've always been a great fan of backcasting. I've always been a great fan of defining the perfect future and then checking every step you take in terms of whether it brings you closer to that future or further away from it. But I think on climate change, in spite of my love for backcasting, we will for the next couple of years still be in an incremental mode. We are still learning. We're moving forward carefully. We're trying to help each other along a road to what is feasible. So for the time being, even though it may be imperfect, for the next couple of years, I think we still need to be, unsatisfying though it may be, in a process of moving forward, building confidence, growing the crowd, and not yet in a position to be able to identify a common, shared, clear vision of the perfect future.